Hey there! My name's Victoria Barrett, and I'm here to talk about the role of research in the expansion and drafting of my novel in progress, Ghost Road. Some of the work on this novel was supported by a grant from the Indiana Arts Commission, as is this video, and I hope this video can be helpful to writers who are thinking about the role of research in their own creative work. We have such a strong sense of the value of research in the world, in academic writing, but often we think of it as this closed down process that can be boring or tiresome, and it's been exactly the opposite in the process of my work on my book. So, to begin with, Ghost Road was a very personal project. To go all the way back to its beginning as a creative project, it probably started in 2006 when my mother showed up at my house with a stack of photos. She told me that my stepmother had written her a letter and said that my father, who I haven't seen in close to 30 years, was dying, and so she was sending the old photos. And here are some of the photos she sent. That's my mother and I in front of her car in our old yard. And that's my father at some earlier date. That's me in the kitchen of the farmhouse we lived in when I was small. This is my father, sister, and brother, and I was the baby there on Christmas. This is my father asleep in a chair. This is me on a house-sized drift and pile of snow, the infamous blizzard of January 1978. This is me in front of some very fuzzy wallpaper. There's my father eating some corn on the cob with a beautiful 16-ounce glass bottle of 7-Up. My father carrying me on his back. And these images to me seemed to tell a story I didn't know, even though it was my story. And so I sat down to write tiny snippets, tiny little image-driven short pieces of flash fiction. And then I set them aside for a long time. And then sometime around 2013, I got them back out and wrote a few more, and I began to explore further. And I began to explore some of the personal aspects that were really painful from my childhood. We all have those, and they're often good sites of writing. And then I got stuck because I didn't want to relive those days and those experiences. And I set it aside again. And then a year or two ago, I started thinking about those images, I started thinking about those experiences, and I thought, what if those weren't mine? What if those belonged to strangers who don't really exist? And when I began to think of my parents and my family as not the people in my story, but as the just genesis of a story of a different family that lived a different life in the same place and the same time, the work I'd been doing began to seem truly like a novel. And so that place and time is 1976 to 1980 in the farmland just north of Lebanon, Indiana. Just south of Lebanon, Indiana, which is just a little ways north of Indianapolis. You can see the location where my actual family lived and worked, and then where the family in my novel lived and worked, from I-65 if you drive up from Indianapolis. And what I wanted to do was to imagine a different life and to write people into existence who were not the ones I knew. And as soon as I began to depart from my experiences and think about the world at large, the work I'd been doing became a novel. And so the time and place where you drank 7-Up out of green glass bottles, and where you worked the land in a different way, really became an incredibly rich source of world building for me. And I realized as I sat down to imagine this family's life that I was going to need to do some research about farming processes. And that research was part of what I proposed for the grant for the Indiana Arts Commission. And I reached out to a few experts, a few agricultural engineers and professors and experts to get a look at what farming processes were like in 1976. And then I hit a gold mine. Because as it turns out, the real farm that my father managed from 1976 to 1980 was one of the farms that led the way to the massive farm consolidation that moved America away from family farming and into megaculture, into the monoculture farms that are really all we have now. So if you think about Farm Aid, if you think about the John Mellencamp song, Rain on the Scarecrow, my family and the people who were working with my family, the people who owned the land where my father worked, were the bad guys in that narrative, because they expanded and expanded and expanded and bought up all of the family farms. Around the time that the novel begins, I learned through lots of online research and through reading up articles that I've collected in this binder. The average grain farm in the Midwest, in Indiana, was 140 acres. At the height of its existence, the farm my dad managed was 17,000 acres, with 11,000 here in Indiana and an additional 6,000 in Mississippi. Now, when you think about buying up land in Mississippi, what do you start to learn about? Where does that curiosity grow at this point? Well, if you know a little bit about American history and are ready to read some more, what you learn is that as we were all buying up this land and making it our own and doing our own thing, what we were doing was disenfranchising black farmers in a massive move of farm disenfranchisement that had a gigantic impact on the land they had available to them, on the farming they were able to do, on the ownership that they could have of land and building wealth. And for some of these people, they had been either sharecroppers or owners of this land for generations. And so I read a lot of articles about that history. I found some scholarly articles about that history, and there's a wonderful retrospective in The Atlantic about the ways in which this massive farm consolidation movement that was very much driven and encouraged by the work of the U.S. Department of Agriculture in the late 1960s into the 1970s resulted in the mass disenfranchisement of black farmers in the United States and of a lot of other people. So that element has to come into the story now, and the story just became, as I learned about the real farm where my father worked and attempted to build an imaginary one to represent some of those familial ties and familial pulls, this just became the story of our food chain. It became the story of corporate agriculture. It became the story of how our land changed so much that there really aren't any more family farms. And when you see family farms now, often what you see is farm tourism. You see educational farms. These are the only ways small operations can run a farm now, largely because of these federal programs during the Gerald Ford administration that fed a rush to buy up land in mass amounts. And so you might buy your first farm with a $40,000 federal loan, and before long, you're buying up thousands and thousands of acres. And then there are no more family farms, and then there is only monoculture. At the same time this was going on, the Department of Agriculture was also really aggressively encouraging and rewarding via subsidies the work of farmers who were maximizing every single inch of every single acre. The whole discussion you might see in a fertilizer commercial during a football game about maximizing yield. We always hear that phrase, maximizing yield, when we think about farming and farm products. That was a big push by the Department of Agriculture to make every single inch of that land valuable. What did that value mean? It didn't necessarily mean it was feeding people. A huge portion of that land gets used to feed cows because the grain that's produced becomes cattle feed. Eventually, that program of farm subsidies was paying farmers to destroy completed crops because they needed to keep the land value at a certain level and they needed to keep farmers on it, but they had created a system through subsidies and through the massive growth of operations that were not sustainable. So suddenly, my novel is no longer the story of a small family on a small farm, in a small place, in a small world. Now my story is the story of our land. All because I just did a little bit of research about farming practices. So, what came next in the long run from these farming practices? Climate change. Fertilizer runoff, seed keeping, but more importantly, seed patenting. All of the large agricultural practices that have had a massive impact on our climate came as a result of this same push during the late 60s to maximize yield and consolidate farms. I learned through some research, because there was actually some news coverage of the actual farm where my father worked, that at one point the farmer my father worked for, who my father was the manager of that farm, during one season he employed more people moving fences than he employed working the land in that push to use every square inch. All of this information in terms of research was found through a variety of web searches and academic searches. The climate information is all coming from library databases, from science journals, from that kind of stuff. And it turns out that there are lots and lots of web available articles and news archives covering many of these changes in the history of farming that took place around that time. Now, the texture of my story will come largely, and is coming largely, from these photographs and from my memory. And one of the things that's happened for me is that as I've learned more about the big picture surrounding my story, the details and memories of that story are becoming more vivid and clear. And it doesn't matter if they're correct to me. I was 2 years old in 1976, and there are limits to what I remember, but what matters is that they are accurate to the way someone might have lived. And there is an enormous wealth of information available online about that as well. Fashion magazines from the time are a wonderful resource for that. Magazines like about household stuff, about lifestyle, are wonderful for that. Wikipedia has the full detailed TV schedule for just about every season since there's been network TV. And so I wanted to have, for example, in one scene, I wanted to have Maura, one of my main characters, answer the phone, and to have her be able to hear the theme song of a show that would be playing both in her living room and in the other person's living room on the phone. What year was that? What season was that? What time of year that was that? What day of the week was that? What time of night was that? I pinned all those down and found out what they would have been watching was Grizzly Adams. So looking online for some of those aspects of the texture of daily life, I also found lists of music that was popular at the time and thought about who my characters were. It turns out, as I certainly should have remembered, that that was the huge boom time for outlaw country. So I bought the Outlaws record that Willie Nelson made with Waylon Jennings, and have been listening to that. So the research has run the gamut from buying a pair of silver cowboy boots in honor of my character Jack, who always wore cowboy boots, and buying a pair of earth shoes in honor of Maura, who always wore, well, who wore a pair of earth shoes and really loved them, all the way through to climate science that I've looked up via library resources, and everything in between. So as my novel grew, and as I built this larger story, I realized that if this is going to be the story of our food, if this is going to be the story of the land that fed us for so long and still does, and also the story of the way that land changed our whole lives and our whole culture, and really gave rise to food science, which gave rise to all of the packaged foods that we now have to sort of re-examine for their impact on our health. Foods that have been designed to be borderline addictive for us, added value in foods. Every bit of that arose from this period in our history where the Department of Agriculture began to engage science in order to maximize yield. And in turn, farmers began producing so much corn that they needed to find other places to sell it besides China, the USSR, and the cattle companies. So we have all of this explosion from the idea that I wanted to write about one family farm. And as I moved into that direction then, I wanted to think, how is this an archetypal story? How is there some mythology or magic here? Because it's very magical, isn't it? The way that we take the Indiana forests and cut down the trees, and suddenly we have land that feeds and nurtures an entire population, and then eventually feeds and nurtures an entire economy, sometimes at that population's expense. So I wanted to look into agricultural mythology, and I began collecting some books and some stories and looking at some websites about mythology. Now, as with writing about the black farmers who were disenfranchised, I don't want to write about voices that are not my own. I want to include their stories. I want to have a world in my novel that is big enough that readers know that I haven't ignored these stories. But I also believe strongly in the Own Voices movement, and the Own Voices movement instructs me that I have no business as a white woman occupying those voices. So I will bring those stories in, but when I begin to look at agricultural mythology, it turns out that most of it does not belong to me. It's not my place to write Egyptian mythology. It's not my place to write African mythology. But there are some myths and some stories that fit beautifully with my character's heritage and with my characters, in fact, as it turns out. And so two myths that I then moved forward into researching, two mythological characters who were actually married. One is called the Dagda, and he is an Irish figure who controls the change of the seasons, and he controls agriculture, and he has in his possession always a suckling pig and a roasting pig. He has always in his possession a staff that can take life, but that can also resurrect, and has the ability to change time. And so when the seasons come and the growth comes, it's his responsibility. His wife, the Morrigan, is often represented as a changeling who can change into a crow. And of course, if you're looking at Indiana and our our giant oceans of corn. What birds do you get? You get crows, right? And so we have Morrigan, who can look in a man's eyes and see what battle he will die in. And we have the Dagda, her husband, who can stop and start time, who can feed endlessly whoever he wishes. His cauldron is always full, no matter how much is taken from it. And so my research has continued in that vein so that I can bring some of the texture of archetype and mythology into the novel, all as a result of seeing how big this story really is from the process of research and moving from that acknowledgement into thinking about the stories that transcend our cultures and transcend our lives. Here's what happens in our history as we move forward with farming from 1976 to 1980. In January of 1980, as the Cold War was really heating up, Jimmy Carter signed an executive order declaring a moratorium on the shipment of wheat to the USSR. The USSR was our biggest wheat exporting nation. And overnight, land value on US farms plummeted. Before that happened, the farmer my father worked for had about $35 million worth of land. His wealth was valued at about $35 million. The next day, he lost $8,000 an hour. So we have a real tight link here between these almost imaginary valuations of land, the way corporate markets and policy define everything about the very dirt we stand on and plant our food in. And to me, that is the quintessentially Midwestern story. That is the story of Indiana. And it's the story, in many ways, of our country. So as I began to understand how big this family's story was, all because I wanted to learn more about how farming was done in 1976, I had the great luck to grow my novel from this small thing, these tiny 1 or 2 or 3 page glimpses of imagery I started with, into something that once it's finished I hope will be large and expansive and will tell the story of so many people, and of our planet and of our land. And hopefully this can help you think about and be inspired to bring in the wider world into your writing as well. Thank you.